So tell us, why should people care about Venezuela? I mean, you've even written in your book that it's the end of the U.S. empire, and really, what I think, what I'm gathering is that this would be sort of a microcosm. It's like one more example of how the U.S. operates, how the empire operates, how regime change operates. So it's, I mean, why should people care from your viewpoint about Venezuela?
It's an interesting question because there's the obvious answer from the perspective of Washington and London. I can tell you why they care about Venezuela. They care about Venezuela because it has the largest oil reserves in the world by far, meaning 60% more than Saudi Arabia, which has the second largest oil reserves in the world. And on top of that, they have the largest untapped gold deposits in the world. So liquid gold and gold, if you want it, it's in Venezuela, on top of rare earth minerals, precious metals, all of this, it's there. And in fact, the Allied fight in World War II, this is a fact I bring up in the book, was pretty much fueled on top of American oil with Venezuelan oil because the British military was completely reliant on oil imports. They didn't have any oil of their own. And between 1939 and 1942, Venezuela went from providing 40% to 80% of British oil imports. So without that crude, we may have not had an Allied victory in World War II. That's the level of concern Washington, London, and the transatlantic Western imperial axis maintain in Venezuela. For American
Mm.
citizens, the reason that they should care about Venezuela is, well, to begin with, part of the reason why we saw this surge in gas prices when the Biden administration unveiled an oil embargo against Russia last year is that in 2019, as part of its Venezuela coup, the Trump administration handed down an identical embargo on Venezuelan oil. So we cut ourselves off from Venezuelan oil imports at that time. They were providing around 7% of US oil imports, which is quite significant. And overnight, Russia at that point gained 7% of the US market. And I have this chart in my book. What that meant was, I think it probably meant that Russia was buying Venezuelan oil and selling it back to us just so that we could get around our own stupid sanctions. Or Russia just filled the gap with their own product. Well, the point is that when the Biden administration then put an embargo against Russia, we lost both of those sources of oil, and that's absolutely contributed to the rising costs. Our relationship with Venezuela and their oil industry goes back a century now at this point. We have the infrastructure and the ability to begin importing Venezuelan oil and processing it and selling it in the United States tomorrow if we wanted to do that. And it's our own stupid ideological government that is doing it, not that is banning us from having that oil. It's not an ideological socialist dictator in Caracas that is preventing the free flow of the market. You see what I'm saying there? All of these labels quickly begin to fall apart. They would be happy. They would have been happy to sell us their oil. But then on a more transcendent point, aside from the economics, American citizens, I want to argue, should feel a certain kinship with the Venezuelan people because they are actually, their history and their evolution as a country is very similar to our own. In fact, it's deeply linked to our own. One of their premier independence anti-colonial heroes, Francisco de Miranda, who was a general in the South American Revolutionary War, actually participated in the U.S.-American War of Independence decades before he fought in Venezuela. He came and laid siege to King George's troops in Pensacola, Florida, because at that time, Venezuelans saw the fight against European empires and colonialism as shared between the North and the South. And Venezuelan officials will still talk about this, that they looked to us decades later. Simón Bolívar and Francisco de Miranda looked to Thomas Jefferson and George Washington when they kicked the Spanish out of South America. And so we really have this kind of a sister history where we evolved through colonialism and slavery and our own independence wars. But unfortunately, as the United States adopted the Monroe Doctrine, which was essentially when Monroe saw the writing on the wall that the Spanish were out of Latin America, he came in and recognized Venezuela's independence, or what was known as Gran Bolivar, or Gran Colombia, this state that Bolivar established while fighting the Spanish crown, but not because he believed those people were entitled to their own sovereign rule. He and others in the United States, unfortunately, then started to see South America as part of our own manifest destiny. It didn't just mean going out west. It meant that we were entitled to inherit Spain's colonial legacy in the Americas. And so we embarked on this policy, which people I'm sure are very well informed about, your viewers, whether it's the banana republics of Central America or the devastating coups in Chile and across the South American continent and the Caribbean over the last century. That policy is the outcome of Monroe's theory, which really defined this region as the United States' backyard. I would say that we should begin treating it as our immediate neighborhood. And that should mean that we should have really good relations and, in fact, prioritize our relationships with Mexico, with Brazil, with Argentina, and with Venezuela, rather than having this weird special relationship with our former colonial overlords in Europe. But that is why
I say the same thing. It makes no sense to have to cross an ocean in order to have we have this kinship with Europe, and we're crossing an ocean in order to, but we have neighbors right here, and wonderful neighbors that I would love nothing more for us to actually start building up, and it's just like owning a house. You want your neighbors to also have nice homes. Otherwise, they junk up the neighborhood and it's not safe. It's not good for anybody around you. It's better if you all are doing really well. It's better for you on a selfish level if your neighbors are doing really, really well and have nice, beautiful homes and they can provide for themselves and whatnot. Why do you think the U.S., so what is it about Maduro that the U.S. targeted and wanted? Why do you think they wanted to get rid of him? I mean, you make great points that Venezuela was happy to sell us oil. So it's not like they cut us off and then the U.S. said, well, then we need to get that guy out of there because we're not able to access the oil. The reason why we can't have Venezuelan oil is because of us. We've decided it's sanctioned. We're not going to, just like Russian oil, right? It's sanctioned. We're not going to. They're happy to give it to us, to sell it to us. We're just not wanting to, we're just on principle. We're not going to do it. Well, why is that principle there to begin with? What is it about Venezuela and Maduro that the U.S. said, this is unacceptable, this guy's got to go?
Venezuela would sell us their oil. The problem is that when Chavez came in 1999, he asserted Venezuela's sovereign control of their oil. So yes, they would sell it to us, but before then, we pretty much operated Venezuela as a giant oil well. The U.S. and British petroleum companies, once they discovered oil in Venezuela a century ago, and as I say, then fueled the Second World War, thanks to that fact that they found the oil, really never gave up control of Venezuela was not a sovereign state. It was in name, but essentially colonialism hadn't ended. Their entire policies were written by Washington. They had to liberalize their economies and just let Exxon, essentially, and ConocoPhillips and Royal Dutch Shell operate their oil economy. And when Chavez came in, he said, well, actually, this is our oil. We're going to decide what to do with the profits. The profits are going to go into the coffers of the Venezuelan government. So yeah, they would sell us the oil, but Washington really never gave up on this idea that it could restore its total dominion over the Venezuelan oil industry and just get its own companies, Chevron, Exxon, in there again, owning it. Not buying it, but owning it. And when Chavez died, in 2013, they really thought this was their chance to seize control of the Venezuelan state that that they believe the entire revolution was all just based on Chavez, and that, oh, this guy Maduro, he's a bus driver. There's no way that this will actually last. So they upped the ante and really waged this all-out war, thinking that the government would fall like that, and they failed. I mean, Bolton said in 2019, when they recognized Guaido, he said, we'd really love to have U.S. He went on Fox Business and said, we'd really love to have U.S. oil companies in there operating in Venezuela once again. I mean, he stated it plainly.
Okay. So yeah, so basically it's not really, the government is always going to frame things like, oh, well, we want to spread democracy because governments are supposed to be doing government work, government things. But in reality, what it sounds like is that the corporations who want to make money on Venezuelan oil are pressuring the US government to, because really the corporations are in charge of the US government. They're the donors. They're the ones lobbying them. They're rubbing elbows with all of the people in Washington. So they're saying to them, hey, listen, we have an agenda, and that is we want to take over the oil in Venezuela. We want to commoditize it and commercialize it and sell it. We want to be doing all of that. And so there's money to be made there. And so you need to get rid of this Maduro guy. You need to be sanctioning Venezuela in order to get rid of this nationalistic idea that the Venezuelan oil coming out of Venezuela's land belongs to the Venezuelan people. What a crazy idea. Get rid of that idea and make sure that the corporations can come in there. So is this why, just putting this together, is this why you call it corporate coup, Venezuela and the end of the US empire? Is that the corporate coup? It's really the corporations who are actually wanting this regime change in Venezuela and who are wanting to get in there and take over the oil.
You hit the nail on the head. That's why it's called corporate coup, and the most important takeaway I hope that people will have from this interview is that, yes, we can make fun of Guaido for failing and being in Miami all we want. We can acknowledge the fact that on its face, the recognition of his shadow regime failed, but it served a very important purpose for Western corporations, particularly Western oil companies, and this other corporation, which is barely operating, called Crystalex. What I document in the book is how, while the coup failed in terms of its material goals in Caracas, it succeeded in a major way because simply by taking the act of recognizing a parallel government, Washington, London, Lisbon, Madrid, all of the Western powers froze Venezuela's assets that were based in their respective accounts and transferred it over to this unelected coup regime, which I go through all of the characters that represent it in the United States. They're all functionaries of the private oil industry or private corporations in general. So as I said, Carlos Vecchio, he was a lawyer for ExxonMobil who led the legal challenge against Venezuela's effort to nationalize its oil reserves when Chavez came into power. Now he's in Washington and Miami leading this coup regime and in charge of billions of dollars of Venezuelan assets that were just stored in the United States because of our oil trade and because everybody at one point was storing their assets in the United States. I don't think they're going to be doing that much anymore, by the way. But through that recognition, they also, through the courts in the US, set the stage for Citgo, which you might recognize as a gas station in the United States. It's actually a subsidiary of Venezuela's state oil industry. So all of their oil was coming from Venezuela, and through a chain of command, it was linked back to Venezuela. There were all of these private corporate vultures. They're US bondholders. And in this one case that I talk about, Crystalex, a Canadian gold mining company, that were suing the Venezuelan state for a whole litany of reasons in World Bank courts, where they're heavily favored to rule in favor of these private interests. And for this Crystalex company was suing Venezuela because they had a contract to develop, as I said, a gold mine in Venezuela, which has, the largest gold reserves in the world, untapped gold reserves. And Venezuela decided not to actually follow through with the contract before it had been officially approved. This company took Venezuela to court at the World Bank, had a multi-billion-dollar settlement ruled in favor, but then they had no actual ability to get Caracas to pay this settlement because they had no way to, hold a gun to Maduro's head and say, pay us the money. What happened was after the US seized all of this billions of dollars in Venezuelan assets, Crystalex and other companies that had sued Venezuela said, oh, now we can go to the US courts and say all of this stolen money that you've taken from Venezuela, we can use that to pay this imaginary World Bank settlement that just arbitrarily said this company has the right to take billions of dollars from Venezuela because they shut down a mine that was never even operational. And the crazy thing is, Juan Guaido's attorney general in the United States, who took over as ostensibly defending Venezuela against these legal attacks following the recognition of Guaido, he actually was exposed ultimately as having worked as a paid witness in this case, the Crystalex case that had targeted Venezuela's government. And he, once he came into power in the eyes of the United States, functioned in U.S. courts to help these companies actually seize all of these billions of dollars and seize Venezuelan assets. They won thanks to the fact that he took over and then pretty much proved their own legal strategy. He'd worked previously for people that were suing Venezuela in court, then came over and worked for Venezuela's government in the eyes of U.S. courts. So it was a complete conflict of interest. And so now Citgo is on the verge of liquidation in order to pay back all these claimants that have come and demanded that the Guaido regime pay out. And it shows how this policy did succeed in a major way by jeopardizing billions of dollars in Venezuelan assets here. And in London, $2 billion worth of gold, Venezuela's central bank gold that was stored in the Bank of England, simply because they recognized Guaido. Now London has said they're holding on to that gold indefinitely. Maduro actually initiated a repatriation request in the fall of 2018. So this was about 3 or 4 months before the UK recognized Guaido. He said, I want my gold back, bring it back to Caracas. So conveniently, London recognized this parallel government and said, oh, sorry, we don't know who actually has a right to claim the gold now. We're just going to keep it in our bank forever. So the corporate coup, yes, succeeded in that way in Venezuela. But you're right. Ultimately, I conclude by saying the corporate coup is really something that happened in our own country a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's probably what's fueling really most of our foreign policy decisions in the US is really corporations with, they've got gold in their eyes, they've got dollar signs in their eyes, and they're thinking we can make a lot of money. And we're already seeing that with Ukraine, for example. With Ukraine, they're already talking about rebuilding Ukraine and all the companies that are going to go in there and help rebuild. And in reality, that means own resources, make a lot of money off the Ukrainian people, and have a large footprint in that part of the world in order to make more just gobs of cash. I mean, it's really just we're already hearing that when it comes to Ukraine and a lot of other places in the world too. It's like, how can we get in there and make some money rather than allowing the people that are there make the money? It's no, America's going to go in there and make all the money.
Yeah, and they're definitely not operating in the interest of the American public. That's the most,
Right.
Maybe people in some ways in the past would have justified it. I wouldn't. But if we were improving the lives of Americans by going around and exploiting the rest of the world, as we did for a long time, where Americans actually benefited, you could make the case that we're a great, successful empire. No, now it's gotten to the point that these people, the elite that are running our country, they're not only exploiting everyone else, they've really destroyed everybody's lives here in our own country. It's the same. We are all victims of the same network. And it's backfired too, because the rest of the world was not going to put up with this forever. That's why I say my book is called Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire, because really what we did in Venezuela, we went so far that we sent a message to the world. Definitely don't put your money and assets in Western banks. But also, we weaponized the dollar and the Western-based financial system to the extent that other alternatives are rising now, and we don't really have any control over that.
Well, I'm someone who doesn't sleep well, and my 11-year-old shepherd named Scarlet, she's a beautiful golden shepherd. She's getting older, and she does have some aches and pains when she walks. She's kind of hobbling around now that she's 11, turning 12. And this is why I looked into cbdistillery.com for a natural way to help me get some sleep and give my furry family member the relief that she needs. CB Distillery has over 2 million satisfied customers. 90% of customers report that they sleep better with CBD. 81% said CBD helps them with stress. 80% said CBD helps with aches and pains after physical activity. So if you struggle to get a good night's sleep, or if you're dealing with too much stress and you could use a little calm in your life, if you suffer with pain and discomfort, especially after physical exercise, then try CBD from the source that I trust, cbdistillery.com. You're going to get 20% off your order when you enter my name, Kim, at checkout. There's no prescription required. That is cbdistillery.com. Promo code Kim for 20% off.